Hello and welcome to everyone. I'll just let folks trickle in here real quick. As that happens, I will go ahead and introduce myself. So I'm Brianne Eby, Senior Policy Analyst at the Eno Center. And thank you. Welcome to those of you who maybe are just joining today, and welcome back to those who were with us yesterday. We're so excited to host you here for our Project Delivery Symposium, where we're digging a little bit deeper into our research on the topic. But today's sessions, these concurrent sessions that are happening right now, are really all about the peer research that's ongoing. And so I'm excited to welcome Dr. Leah Brooks to go through some of her research. But before I do that, just a couple of housekeeping rules. So just want to remind everybody that this is a 1-hour session, and after today's session, or the session right now, there will be a 30-minute break. And after the afternoon session, so those of you who are able to stick around for a little bit longer today, there will be an optional networking room. So that gives you all an opportunity to talk with each other, with today's researchers and with the Eno staff as well. So that will be available via Zoom beginning at 2:30 p.m. We do have, again, as I said, some sessions before that, so please do be able to stick around and tune in for those. Should be some great content later today. All of our sessions will be recorded and will be posted after the fact, so you can go back and access sessions that you were not able to attend. There's some concurrent sessions that are happening right now that might also be of interest. You can access all of the sessions on the agenda tab to the left of your screen on the Socio platform. After today's session, you'll be prompted to rate and to evaluate this panel, and your feedback is so valuable to us, so please do take the time to offer comments and rate each session. It's a pretty quick process. And one more housekeeping note, so throughout today's presentation, you can enter questions for the Q&A session. We'll have an audience Q&A at the end of the hour today. So please do, as things arise, please do go ahead and type those in, and we'll be sure to address those in our session, or in the Q&A session later on. You can also bring them up during the Q&A. So with that, I'll introduce Dr. Leah Brooks. Leah is an economist and associate professor at the George Washington University's Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. She studies political economy and public and urban economics. And her recent work that caught our eye evaluates infrastructure costs across time and place. And she's going to provide much more insight on that in her presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Brooks.
Thank you, Brianne. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your really exciting work on transit costs. I'm going to talk, I promise, Brianne, no longer than a half hour and possibly less about my work. And then I'm open for questions. And I also want to say there's a paper posted on Social Science Research Network, and this paper was just conditionally accepted at an economics journal. So we should have a final, truly final paper out hopefully in the next couple of months. And we're also preparing, as part of the publication process, that I should say, me and my co-author, Zach Liscow, along with some hardworking research assistants, a replication package. So if somehow these data are interesting or relevant to you, or any part of these data, you can grab the replication package and pull out whatever it is that is of interest to you. So all that said, let me say that I'm talking today about infrastructure spending. And we are talking about infrastructure spending in part because infrastructure has been in the news. It's been in the news since at least the Trump administration, talking about spending more on infrastructure. But given all the talk about infrastructure, it turns out that we know very little about how much we get per dollar we spend. And this is a question of great importance. We spend a lot of money in the United States already on infrastructure, and we're proposing to spend quite a bit more. And the more each individual piece of infrastructure costs, the lower the power of any additional infrastructure spending. And this is all combined with this widespread perception that costs are high in the US. And I think until very recently, this was a perception without much data. And there's been some work, ours, which focuses mostly on the US. We do in the draft that's going to be published in the journal, a tiny bit of comparative work showing that suggestive evidence that costs in the US are quite high. And Eno's work showing that infrastructure costs in the US are quite high. So why do we know so little about how much it costs to build things? Because in some sense, it seems like the most obvious thing to understand about public projects, like they're public? Shouldn't the amount that's spent on them be public? Strangely, data are limited. And for obvious reasons, international comparisons are difficult to interpret. Different parts of the government bear different costs in different countries. And even domestic comparisons are difficult because there are different regulatory regimes, even across the country. And furthermore, the unit of analysis is hard to define. So you couldn't say that, because New York spends more on its airport than Topeka, Kansas, that New York's airport is more costly. I mean, it's more costly in a total sense, but it's not obviously more costly in a per unit sense. And that's really what we care about when we're talking about the cost of building infrastructure. So all that to say that we focus in this project on interstate highway system, in part because it has a unit that we can measure. And we ask, has per unit spending on interstate highways increased in the United States? And in this paper, we're looking over the period of the large growth of the interstate system from its inception in 1956 till the end of the initial build out in the early 90s. So over that period, yes, per unit spending, so per mile spending on interstates, increased about threefold in real terms. That means accounting for inflation, we see about a 3 times increase in the per mile cost of building interstate highways. And then, of course, the next obvious question you would like to ask is why? And that's a harder, it was hard to figure out how much it costs per mile to build an interstate, but it's even harder to figure out why. And we're going to offer some suggestive evidence in this paper. We're also going to show you some things that you might think would be a likely explanation for cost increases, but are not. All right, so let me break down a bit this problem of infrastructure analysis, at least as we worked on it in this paper. We're going to focus on interstate construction, and that's going to limit analysis to something that's relatively similar across place and time. It's, as anyone who's driven ever an interstate mile will tell you, not all interstate miles are created equal, and we would heartily agree, but I think most people would agree that an interstate mile is a more similar physical unit than a piece of a port or a piece of an airport, things that are harder to split into sort of analyzable units. All right, so first we're going to ask, has spending per mile increased over time? Our answer is yes. And in summary, this is not because we're building interstates in more difficult places later. It's not that they waited on the expensive pieces. And we're going to show you that the spending is actually not turning up until the early 1970s. So there's a period where the cost per mile is relatively flat, and then a period where the cost per mile just heads up a hill. What correlates with this spending increase? I'm going to show you that it's not per unit cost. So it's not the cost, it's not per unit wages, it's not per unit cost of materials. We see higher spending in states with higher income after 1970, and we see higher spending in states with higher home prices after 1970. So and both of those are sort of statistical explanations. It's not that we think that the income itself is driving the higher spending, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. And then we're going to conclude by discussing sort of what are the broader forces that are driving these cost or spending increases. And we're going to hypothesize that there is a rise in what we call citizen voice, which is the ability of people to interact with government and tell the government what they would like in their construction. And we're going to show you some evidence that's consistent with that. We're going to show you that we build more noise walls and wigglier interstates, particularly after 1970. And we're going to show you that, at least in the rhetoric, politicians care more about the environment in this period as well, and associate the environment with interstates in their discussion about them. All right, so let me give you what I call the light speed relevant background on the interstate system. Think of the interstates as being a creature of the second half of the 20th century in the United States. So one of the great infrastructure achievements of the second half of the 20th century. They started with the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, which provided interstate funding. It planned a 41,000 mile system, and virtually all the funding was limited to initially determined routes. And the federal government is paying most of this system. So you don't want to think about this as the federal government pays 90%, states pay 10%. So you want to think about this for the states, where the states they're not putting out their own money. They're putting out federal government money to build the interstate system. And the interstate system also has relatively similar federal standards for construction in all states at a given time. And construction is largely complete by 93, and that's the period which we cover, 56 to 93. So because the system is fixed, it's really the states choosing how much to spend and not how many miles to build. The federal government gives states a fixed system, and they say, if you build it faster, you need to spend less money because the allocation of money is fixed in a given year. But if you're willing to build it more slowly, you can spend more on each individual mile. So in each year, feds authorize spending in the amount of the gas tax revenue. And then they apportion spending, which means they divide that tax revenue between states based on an estimated cost to complete. And then feds reimburse the states when they spend money. So bottom line here is there's no cap for states on how much money they can spend for a particular mile of interstate. Of course, if you spent all your money on 1 mile of interstate, you're never going to build out your interstate system in your state because you spent all your money so insanely slowly. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the data we gathered to make this project. And I'm particularly going to talk about spending per mile. So I'm going to start with the spending. So we digitized the Federal Highway Administration's highway statistics at the state level from 1956 to 2016. So we know how much money states spend on the federal interstate system in these years. And that spending includes construction, planning, and land acquisition. It excludes maintenance, refurbishment, expansion, and the local match. So what you want to think about what our measure captures is the federal spending on new interstate miles. That's our goal here. We divide that to get spending per mile by miles completed. Miles come from the U.S. Department of Transportation via Nate Baum Snow, and those are annual from 1956 to 93. So we concentrate on this 56 to 93 period. And during this period, from the second data source, we know for each 1 mile segment of the interstate when that segment opened and where that segment is located. We combine these to make a spending per mile measure. Now, I'm happy to talk a lot more about this, but for purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to say the spending does not always line up with the miles. We do some things to make them line up, and to make a coherent measure, we're going to put periods of 6 years together for most of our analysis. So we're going to have spending per mile in a 6-year period. So to address our first research question, has spending per mile increased over time? Putting those data together, the spending from the Federal Highway Administration and miles from DOT, here's what we see. We see spending per mile roughly tripling since the 1960s, 1970s. You can see that spending is flat at the beginning and then relatively flat at the beginning here, and then ticks upward after, say, the early 1970s. This is the annual data. This is a somewhat smooth series, and these are the 6-year periods we're going to use throughout. But, it doesn't really matter what we do to the data. You see this relatively flat beginning and then an upward trend. Now, is this result just noise? So, you might look at the previous picture and say, well, there's a lot of variation in spending per mile. Maybe what you're showing me is something that just, it's a series where over time, there's just more and more variation in spending. It's this variation that's driving that upward tilt and not actual increase. But no, that's not the case. I'm also happy to talk more about the statistics behind this, but just think of the gray area around the green line as the area with which we're reasonably confident that spending falls in. So you can see that, and everything is relative to 1960. So relative to 1960, in 1966, we see that there's a virtually no spending increase. And we can't see that gray area in which we're reasonably confident spending falls in. We can't distinguish that point from zero. That gray area crosses zero. So, from 1960, which is really that first 6-year period, to 1966, that second 6-year period, we can't really say that relative to the 1960 period, that spending in 96 is any higher. But by the time we get to the early 70s, 1972, than 1978, 1994. You can see that gray area is always above the zero axis, telling us that we're seeing a statistically significant increase in spending. And the way you read this chart is that in the final 6-year period by 1990, we see that it cost states on average about $25 million more to build an interstate mile than it did in the first year in 1960. Now, I think another concern you might reasonably have about this kind of setup is to say, well, states might just wait to build the more difficult miles later. If I was a governor, maybe I would prefer to build the easy miles first and get a good win and leave the hard miles to my predecessors. I want to first say that there's actually the historical record doesn't really agree with that kind of argument about how states built miles. In fact, what governors thought and what most people thought when we first started building freeways was that freeways were going to be fantastic and they'd be so great that no one could possibly be opposed to them, and that they were a great solution for urban areas. So because of that, people tended to try to build highways immediately in the places where they thought they were going to deliver the most results in congested urban areas and the places where highways are most expensive to build. So when we control for where highways were built, and I'm happy to talk about this in greater detail if you want to ask in the question section how we do that, we don't see any difference in this time path, basically, bottom line. Still, by 1990, we're spending about $25 million more per mile relative to 1960. That's the blue line. The blue line and the green line, pretty much the same thing. All right, and I just want to point out, which for reasons we'll talk about later, we're going to compare these first 2 periods where we don't see much of an increase to the last 4 periods where we see an upward trend in spending. And I'm going to show you a lot of comparisons comparing what changed in the first period versus the second period. All right. And I want to say in context with this that there are a lot of reasons that spending should fall over this period. I think it would be hard to argue that there's been no technological improvement in road building from 1956 to 93. I think everyone could agree that surveying technology has improved, road building has mechanized, and that manufacturing productivity increases substantially over the period, and there are manufactured good inputs into interstates. So there are lots of reasons we would expect spending to fall, and that's absolutely not what we find. All right, so hopefully we can now agree that there's been a substantial spending increase over this 56 per mile spending on interstate highways from 56 to 93. And now we're going to talk about what correlates with this spending increase. All right, I want to remind you, we've already ruled out the differential location of construction over time. So that is not what's driving this spending increase. Now we're going to talk about 3 other potential drivers: input costs, local income or wealth, and institutional features. So let's go through these. Let's start with input costs. So this is a graph showing you something, a very similar fact to what I showed you already. This is interstate spending per mile, and I have set this up so that our first data point is 100, and the final data point over here is scaled appropriately, and you can interpret this end being that spending at the end of our series is about 4 times higher in real terms than, so that's what the 400 is telling you here, 4 times higher in real terms than at the beginning. All right, and now I'm going to add to this picture spending on materials, also indexed in the same way so that we can read off the changes. All right, so this is a materials price index that I've added to the graph. This materials index includes asphalt, steel, concrete, and possibly something else I cannot remember. But when you look at it, it doesn't, I think it has 4 components. It doesn't really matter. You could look at any one of those components. There's no way you can get any of those price components to anywhere approach the spending per mile increase that we see for the interstates. It's not in the same ballpark. You can see the oil price run up here. I think primarily in asphalt, but there's just almost no increase in real terms in materials over this period. And then second, I'm going to add in construction wages. I'm showing you 2 series. The solid purple line is construction hourly wages, And the dotted purple series is construction compensation per full-time employee, because we know over this period that compensation has increased more than wages. And that's true. Compensation has increased more than wages. But construction hourly wages are pretty much flat in real terms over this period. They cannot be, we could be using more construction workers, but we can't account for the increase in spending by the wages of construction workers alone. It has to be that we hire many, many, many more construction workers. And we can't account for this increase in cost per mile with compensation, because though compensation does seem to trend away from hours, particularly at the end, that difference in compensation versus hourly wage is nowhere near enough to compensate for this increase in spending per mile. So I feel like this is one of the major points of the paper. There's this huge increase in spending per mile. In no way can we account for this increase in the cost of an interstate mile with these input prices. So given that, okay, what else can explain this increase? So let me explain how this chart works. This is the total difference when we compare those first two periods to the last two periods. It's a spending increase on average, comparing the second to the second half to the first half, of about $6 million per mile. And this is conditional on state and geographic features. So I can say conditional on where interstate highways are built, we see about a $6 million increase in spending per mile from the second period to the first period. How much of that spending increase can be accounted for by wages? If you're techie, this is a Oaxaca blinder decomposition. I'm happy to talk about it more if you're interested. But bottom line, as you saw in the previous picture, wages just can't account for much of this increase. Doesn't matter how we measure wages, any construction wage measure is just nowhere near explaining this difference. What about if we look at changes in income? Changes in income, family income and home value, are both pretty tightly correlated with increases in spending. And we know that this isn't through some kind of direct mechanism of taxation, because the money for the federal interstate system is coming from the federal government, not from local taxpayers. But this increase in income and home value in the second period, so 70s onward versus the 50s and 60s, does seem to account for about half of that, in a statistical sense, about half of that spending increase. What about the rise of land use litigation? So we use a measure of land use litigation thanks to some other wise authors already published, and we see that in states that have a greater change in land use litigation, we can account for like maybe a third of this spending increase. So this suggests to us there's something about the litigation environment in these states that is correlated with the spending increase. And then finally, putting everything together, we account for about somewhat less than $5 million of this $6 million change. And you can see that putting everything together, the wages actually explain negative of the change. They don't explain anything at all of the change. The land use cases and the income and home value both remain, substantial contributors to the spending increase. All right, so there are about 1,000 other things you could think of that could explain a spending increase, and they're all detailed in the paper. I'm just naming a few of them here. Here are some other things that we tried to measure to explain the spending increase, and none of them turn out to be statistically important. That could be because they are not important, or it could be because our measure is not a great way of capturing them. So here are things we looked at. We looked at government competition versus the number of measured by the number of governments. We looked at government quality measured by a state's bond rating. We looked at the presence of right to work laws. We looked at the presence of competition in the construction industry via the number of firms per capita. We looked at the presence of a prevailing wage law. We looked at congressional influence, so whether the particular state has membership on the Transportation Committee, and a lot of other things that are in the paper, none of which turned out to be statistically important in explaining the change in spending. Which gets me to point number 3. So I've told you that we see higher spending in states that had larger increases in income. So what is driving? But that's I would say a statistical fact, and not a deep explanation for this increase in spending. So what is driving the spending increase? And I'm going to hypothesize here. You can see that I have some evidence, but I wouldn't say what we have in this paper is a slam dunk. I would say what I'm going to show you is a lot of suggested evidence that this hypothesis, the citizen voice hypothesis, may be an important determinant of spending. All right, so in the late 60s and early 70s, there is a rise of institutions that allow for greater citizen voice in government. And there's a lot of narrative about this. I'm currently working on a project to hopefully flesh this out in a quantitative way. But think of the rise of voice as being an amalgam of the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, and growing homeowner organization. All of these groups give people an organized way to speak to government. And then in addition, there are changes in government institutions, changes in judicial doctrine and statute, give citizens more tools to challenge government decisions. And here are some examples of key dates. So in 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act mandates environmental review. And part of that environmental review is a mechanism for citizens to be involved and to complain when they don't like what's going on. In 1971, the Overton Park versus Volpe decision increases the ability for citizens to challenge federal agency discretion via the court. So if you don't think that the government is faithfully implementing a regulation, you have a increased ability to litigate. So let me give you an example about what we think this means in our context. I'm going to tell you about Detroit's I-696. It's a 28-mile stretch of highway north of the city, and 3 legs. So 1964, first leg is completed, cost $13 million a mile. Now, by our standards in our data, that's actually still pretty expensive, $13 million in 1964. In 1979, the second leg is completed at a cost of $48 million a mile. So that's, slightly more than 10 years later and way more than $10 million per mile more. And in 1989, they finally complete the third leg, which costs $86 million per mile. So what the heck is going on? I'm going to focus in on the last segment. The third leg in this I-696 cuts through an observant Jewish community that walks to services. And the community organizes and local government supports them. Michigan law requires city approval for interstate routes. And the community sues under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So all of these things work together to increase costs. The solution included a rabbi consultant, a depressed highway, plazas above the depressed highway, many noise walls, and pedestrian paths. And I think you can see immediately how these kind of physical hardscape should increase costs. It's less easy to see, but I think also equally comprehensible that all the delays in the approval and decision-making increased costs. Interestingly, this was so contentious. Mitt Romney's father was the governor of Michigan. That's at the time of this decision, and he apparently told all the local officials that he wanted to lock them in a room and not let them come out until they had decided, so they come to a decision about how they were going to solve this problem. It's just like a truly horrifying example of lots of input and being unable to reach a decision. All right, so that's one specific case. Here's a specific example about highways over time getting more stuff that costs money. What I'm measuring here is how wiggly a highway mile is. I'm happy to talk more about that in the discussion, but you can see that in the first 10 or so years of the Interstate program, highways there's no particular growth in wiggliness. But after 1970, we see this pretty substantial upward trend. And, why should a wiggly highway be more expensive? It's a curvy route to get somewhere that you could have possibly gone straight for less money. And why might you wiggle? You might wiggle to get around pre-existing obstacles that, in the past you just bulldoze through, but now you build around because you're accounting for citizen taste. Here's a second one. I think more direct. This is the measure of the millions of square feet of noise wall built over time. So this is not an exact match with our data because this is just all noise walls and we couldn't differentiate by new interstate miles or not. But what you can see is that basically the government doesn't even build noise walls before 1970. They're not a feature of highway construction. And then after 1970, we see this really substantial upward trend in noise wall construction. And I have to say, if I lived near a freeway, I would want a noise wall because freeways are noisy. And I presume that a noise wall makes your life really much improved. Noise walls cost, as we understand from one estimate, about $4 million a mile. So you can also understand how the construction of noise walls substantially increases the cost of a highway mile. This finding about noise walls also holds for ramps, bridges, and elevated highways. So other things that, sort of other physical manifestations. And then finally, we also looked at the text of the congressional record to see how often Congress members, so this is the text of things that Congress members say in Congress, how often Congress members talk about the word environment close to the word interstate. So the beginning of time in our data in the late 40s and early 50s, before the passage of the Federal Highway Act, we never talk about the environment. And I don't think they talk about the environment at all. But what share of the time that politicians talked about the interstate did they talk about the environment? Never. They never talked about the environment. And in fact, after the passage of the 56 Highway Act, they still don't really talk about the environment. In the lead up to the passage of NEPA in 1970, we see this elevation of discussion about the interstate in proximity to the environment in proximity to the interstates. And what's interesting is we would expect that, but that persists. It doesn't disappear after NEPA. So NEPA elevates the concerns of environment relative to interstate, possibly in politician discourse. All right. So I told you a lot about the interstate, but this is a conference about transit. So can we think beyond the interstate system? What does this mean for transit? My guess would be that citizen voice mechanisms are probably at work in transit as well. And has done some pioneering work measuring per unit transit costs. So what are the potential solutions for these citizen voice problems? So the obvious solution is to limit voice, but I think that's not a solution that has a lot of popular appeal. It's not a solution that that we like to look to as a democracy. Here are some other possible solutions. One is to make cost information standardized in public. And I think that might be, after Eno's work on trying to find transit costs, they might also be appreciative of this. There's a lot of cost information that is simply not public, so that we cannot, even if we wanted to compare costs, we could not. You could also create a statute of limitation on initial protest. So that's to say citizens can still have voice, but if you want to have voice, you need to complain within the first 2 years of this project being open. Otherwise, you're hitting a statute of limitations. People have told me that there has been success with policies like this in very specific cases of infrastructure investment, and it might be worth thinking about whether they have more broad applicability. So in sum, we show that interstate spending per mile has risen sharply beginning in roughly 1970. And we know that this cost increase is not explained by per unit costs of labor or materials. And we suggest that factors including citizen voice are the likely culprits. Now, the real bottom line, as I take it from this project, is whether these higher costs are yielding higher quality or more environmentally respectful construction. So is it that we're spending more, but we're getting more? Or is this higher spending yielding no additional value? And we don't speak to that in this project. I think Eno's evidence suggests that at least some of what we see in the US is likely of no additional value, because we see countries with much more stringent environmental regulations than ours building at much lower costs. So that's all I've got to say. Brianne, the floor is yours.
Oh, there we go. I'm a little slow here. Can you see and hear me okay? Great. Okay, well, so thanks so much, Leah. That was a great presentation. We will go ahead and move into the Q&A. We have about 25 minutes for that. So I'll start with some questions and then introduce audience questions as I go. One that I'd like to start with here, though, is looking a little bit further into your methodology and data collection. So you mentioned at the beginning that this was your analysis was focused on federal spending. Is there any research on whether these findings might translate to transit, and specifically the case where there is for transit, there's a much more robust mix of federal, state, local funding, even private financing? The extent to which we can assess different forms of funding and how those changes maybe have happened over time. I know that's not what your analysis focused on, but is that even possible using the methodology that you employed here?
I think the underlying question is whether you could have a data set that would allow you to do this. But if you did, you could certainly see whether projects that have a greater local cost share are less likely to be high spending or overspending. And that seems pretty plausible to me. There's a pretty high federal cost share in a lot of transportation projects, but it might be that projects that have a lower federal cost share come in more under budget. What's unique about this interstate case is that the state governments have very little of their own money at risk. So their incentive to not spend is only because they would like to build the system more quickly. But I think given data, yes, you could look at whether these cost shares matter. And I'd be surprised if they didn't.
Got it. Yeah, our analysis certainly, took into consideration that, right, for transit there are so many different funding streams. So I think, that's one thing that is the main point of difference, I think, between the two contexts. So you mentioned at the top of your remarks, Leah, that we know little about how much we get per dollar spent. There just is not, a ton of information out there. Are there tools or strategies that can help to better communicate both to voters and to policymakers alike that right now our expectations and our perceptions of how much we're spending on infrastructure really don't match reality? Is this an issue that is inherently one of communication? So in other words, there's a need for more clear information, or are there, other maybe economic, institutional, political challenges that are, also contributing to this divergence in perception versus reality?
Yeah, I guess to me, this is not a problem simply of communication, because I think in many circumstances, we don't have information to communicate. It's one thing for me to say, like I do in this presentation, look, we've seen a 3 to 4-fold increase in real spending per mile on the interstates. But I think, our period is 56 to 93. So I think a lot of people would look at this and say, a policymaker would look at this and say, this ends in 93. What do you maybe things are fine now. There's a paper that's similar to ours that looks at a more recent period and also finds a similar trend in spending. So I don't think this is a problem that's isolated to that period. But I think, if you were a policymaker who just wanted to not report about costs, then that would be a response you could make. I think I also know from a discussion with a federal highway administrator from the Trump administration who came in and told the staff, well, I'd like to know how much things cost. And they said, well, we can't tell you. And they said, we can tell you how much money we are spending. Like we could tell you how much money we sent to the state of California, but we can't tie that spending to a particular project. So that, I view that as an institutional deficiency. And until you solve the institutional deficiency, you can't get around to communicating about it. And I'm an academic, not a policymaker, and I'm not sure what the incentives for policymakers are to want to report on costs. I think that's probably mandated reporting on costs. It seems to me one of the better ways to keep costs down. But I'm not sure politicians would be so enthusiastic.
Do you have any reason, beyond, I guess, lack of maybe political will, why there thoughts, I guess, on why mandated reporting has not been successful to date? Or are there, I guess, other examples, other types of infrastructure, other industries entirely where, that type of reporting in your work as an economist, has that been evident in other contexts, and it's just not really, there's not the political will for it here in this context?
That's a good question. So I've done some work on the community development block grant, and that is easier in the sense that the federal government takes the money and it sends it to cities. So it knows exactly how much money it's sending, and then the city is supposed to report back, or the jurisdiction is supposed to report back on what they've done with the money. And that's a really onerous and tedious reporting process for the governments. But the logistics are easier in that you know the money up front, and then you're just getting them to report back on what they did with it. Here, you're sort of allocating money. The federal government is giving some part of the money, but then, as you said, it goes off to a city, and the city is going to take the federal money and combine it with a bunch of other money. And they're going to take the federal money now, but they might not spend it for a while. They might hold on to it while the project gets held up. And then 10 years later, they finally built the thing. And then who are they supposed to report back to? Maybe the politician who suggested is not in the Congress anymore. He doesn't care. So that strikes me as the primary logistical challenge. We need some kind of cost reporting infrastructure that can tie projects together. And that has to be a really long-term infrastructure because of the way the projects are, because of the length of projects.
Sort of in a similar vein, you mentioned that comparisons are difficult to determine. Why ultimately do you think that's the case? And is there, in your experience, a way to strike a good balance between learning from best practices elsewhere and adapting to the needs of individual places?
Well, actually, Brian, I think you know better than me about why comparisons are difficult because you look at all the transit projects. So, I mean, we particularly chose the Interstate because I actually, for a different project, tried to get some figures on costs at ports. And even things that are, more reasonably standard, like dredging, that the Army Corps of Engineers does at many ports in the US. The Army Corps apparently knows exactly how much it costs them to dredge a port, but they don't share that. That is not private information. That is private information, and you can make a FOIA and you might get it or you might not. I think some things are just inherently more difficult to compare. Port infrastructure, I think, is inherently more difficult to compare because you have different types of infrastructure at different types of ports. So making those comparisons is more difficult. In the transit world, I think you're at least on firmer ground. You can make a mile of tramway or a mile of light rail. That's more comparable.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn now to the notion of citizen voice. That's so much of where your takeaways lie. So I have a question about how exactly you measured citizen voice. So was it measured as instances of litigation, maybe the delay that was associated with that litigation or the costs potentially associated with it? And then also, is citizen voice exclusively linked to the NEPA phase, or is it also, or can it happen, I guess, at any other phases in project development? So for example, in the planning, the kind of early stage planning process as well.
Okay, let me answer the second part first, because I think that's a little bit easier. I think these issues of citizen voice can come up at any point in the process. And I wouldn't even, the environmental law gives people a particularly good hook into the planning process because there are these particular requirements with environmental review. And if you don't follow them exactly, you can litigate about them. So they give citizens a particularly good way to get into the process, but it's certainly not the only way. Jurisdictions have asked for all kinds of citizen input, not just input mandated by NEPA. Organized groups give all kinds of input into the process, and those are things that can possibly both improve projects and delay them and make them more costly. On the first part about how we measure citizen voice is a great question. So what we're showing in this paper is really just a constellation of facts that are consistent with that hypothesis. We're not tying the exact are exact measures of citizen voice to the spending increase. I think this is a super fertile place for research, and I have a project that I'm starting now trying to understand how the federal government solicits participation and whether the institutions for participation have changed from the New Deal, and so we're going to start in the 20s, pre-New Deal, and look from New Deal social legislation all the way through the present to try and understand whether the institutions that the federal government uses to require participation or suggest participation have changed over time. What we show in this paper really is just a set of things that are consistent with this hypothesis about citizen voice.
Got it. I'm going to turn now to some audience questions, and just a reminder to folks, you can just type those up into the chat at any point, and we'll start to dig into those. So I have one here from Adam, who says, in my government work experience, delivering a project at a lower cost than the budget is generally not a priority that gets much attention by project managers or by the agency overall. Have you seen successful organizational structures that encourage agencies to prioritize cost savings?
Oh, Adam, that is both a great question and kind of sad. And my answer is no. No, not because it's not possible, but no, because I just don't know about it. I think you, the audience, are probably better primed. I mean, I think what you're pointing out, though, is a reason why we see these cost increases. The people who the incentives to keep costs under control are, frequently at war with other incentives, and it may be hard for cost control incentives to carry the day in a political context.
That's good point there. So I want to, I guess, tack on to another point that you brought up in your presentation, Leah, about the creating a statute of limitations. And you mentioned that there's been success with similar policies in specific other cases of infrastructure investment. I'm wondering what those specific other examples.
Yeah. So someone told me, and I cannot remember all the details now, about pipeline infrastructure. This is quite a while ago, possibly in the Clinton administration, maybe somewhat later. There was a pipeline that the government viewed as particularly critical, and it said they just basically had a statute of limitations. Like, if you want to object to this pipeline, object to it in the first 2 years, file your lawsuit. But if you haven't filed the lawsuit within X years of us starting the pipeline, you're out of luck. To me, this seems like something that might be politically feasible. And I think people may be able to understand why businesses or, contractors or the government too would want certainty, and how certainty is going to lower costs, and how we may all be harmed by protracted litigation. Of course, I can also imagine cases where someone says, but I just didn't know in the first 2 years, and it's so terrible, and my house is going to get torn down. And that might be more, in the end, more compelling. Hard to say.
Yeah, that's I think that's something that we'll probably get into some more detail on our panel sessions later in the week. I know, speaking with folks in Seattle, that's just as with population change, or as a region grows, new people come in, and they potentially rightfully feel like they weren't consulted, or weren't around in the early planning stages of a project. And so this dynamic of how population changes and how that interacts with project development is really interesting, and I think contentious in a lot of places. So
yes, and it's just like the longer your project takes, the more you have of that problem.
Sure, that's true. Here's another audience question, wondering if you've looked at before and after studies that project sponsors were required to complete for large mass transit projects, or I guess in any other infrastructure context as well. to determine any underlying trends for cost increases due to citizen participation?
So my answer is no, though it's a great suggestion. I have not looked at any transit data. I've looked only at these federal highway data. But if you think that there's some fertile data there, could you send me an email? You can Google me. I'm at George Washington. If you think there's a way to see citizen voice in those projects, I would be super interested. I think that it's really a challenge for researchers, because the way we've described citizen voice is as a constellation of factors. So it's not one easily identifiable factor that makes a discrete change at time X, which, as a researcher is exactly what I want, but isn't really how life really works, right? We think of it as a constellation of factors that's civil society, legislation, judicial review, all of them working together to make projects slower, receiving of more feedback, and probably more expensive.
So continuing on with the theme of citizen voice, so on the one hand, there's a lot of engagement among people that, especially have the means to participate in, public meetings, for example. But there's also recognition that many people don't have the means or the resources to engage and to provide feedback on projects. There's also others who want good democracy to be done for them. I've heard of, this kind of phenomenon that as a whole, Americans are kind of disengaged with the democratic process. And, we have this kind of idealized notion of what it means for, democracy to deliver things and to make things work. But we want other people to do that. We don't really want to personally be engaged in that process. So I'm wondering, Leah, if your work distinguishes between the different categories of engagement and what the implications are. And I know this is a big question, but is there anything, that you're thinking of that can be done with the category of people that appreciate the idea of democracy, but that maybe aren't really invested themselves?
Yeah, I think you've brought up a bunch of interesting points. First, the point about the ability to participate. So when you have something like NEPA that gives citizens the ability to engage, and particularly the ability to engage through lawsuits, in some sense, it's democratizing because it opens the doors to anybody who has something to say to government, and something to say that can be taken very seriously because you litigate and the government takes that seriously. On the other hand, who has the ability to litigate? Litigation is costly. And if you're opening the doors to litigation, in some ways you're privileging the voices of those who have the ability to litigate, which is the means to litigate. So I think that kind of opening of the door is not as benign as it seems on the surface. Because while we open the door to everyone, we open the door, but then privilege those who have the ability to pay these costs. Now, the rise of civil society groups does mean that those who can pay those costs in some ways became a broader group of people. Homeowners associations maybe gave middle-class homeowners a way to speak in these forums that they didn't have before. Similarly, civil rights organizations give some people fora that they didn't have to speak in this way. So I don't want to be totally negative on it, but I think we also have to be sort of aware that increased participation is not in itself a panacea. And then the second part of the question you asked about different types of participation. And that's something I sort of know from firsthand research less about, but which I am hoping to be working on in the near future using this long run statute data. So trying to understand what types of participation the federal government allows or requires, and how that has changed over time. And that we're not going to be able to tie to discrete outcomes, but I think even understanding what the mechanisms for participation are would help us understand the role of voice.
Got it. And so this will be our last question. I'm seeing no more audience questions, but we'll end on a really broad note. So what do you think, Leah, that policymakers should do with an understanding of citizen voice? And what role do you think different levels of government have in addressing some of the issues that you've talked about today?
Okay, so first, before I answer that, let me say thanks to you guys for having me. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. And now ending on this very tricky question. All right, first, I think that possibly the easiest is just this mandated cost reporting. Make people make the costs public. I think that's the low, it seems to me, of the political lifts, that one is the lowest. And there's no reason you could not require governments at all levels to make public at the project level things that they already know in-house. I think with like the in-house data capabilities that most jurisdictions have now, this is less of a heavy lift than it used to be. So I think that's the very first thing, because I think even the act of making these costs public, this is back to Adam's question, may make a policymaker sort of more wary about decisions that, oh, this is going to increase things by 50%. Maybe I should, if I think the local newspaper is going to write about it, then maybe I'll be more cautious. So that is the first thing. I think what's difficult about thinking about changes in voice is that we have an entire ecosystem of participation. And if I told you I'm going to change one small part of that ecosystem, I think that will have an effect of literally zero. So it's not that you could tweak at the margins. I think you need a somewhat more fundamental change, possibly like a statute of limitations, to end up with some really substantive changes in costs.
Okay. Well, on that note, I will say thank you to Leah for presenting. This was really phenomenal. Glad to hear, a little bit more, or in your words directly, some insights on your research, and we're looking forward to hopefully that, moving through the publication process soon. I hope that goes quickly for you. And thank you to the audience also for your participation and for asking some great questions. Just a reminder, so we will have a half-hour break now, but our next session, which is a peer research panel, so that includes Eno's research again, as well as other researchers that have been looking at the broader context of this issue for quite some time. So there will be kind of a almost fireside chat kind of format where we compare some of our methodologies and findings. So please tune in for that at 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern. And then at 2:30, we will have those informal networking sessions, like I mentioned. So it's just an opportunity to chat with the other participants as well as the researchers and the Eno staff. So thank you again to everyone for participating, and enjoy the break.
Thank you, Brianne.
Thanks.